Shalom, Keluarga. Allow me to share what the Lord has laid upon my heart in humble submission, first before the Lord and before the leadership of Jaring Gandoa. Something is big, something really big is coming your way, Indonesia. Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 1 speaks about a time when somebody significant, somebody important, somebody strategic died. His name was King Uzziah. And Isaiah 6 and verse 1 says, in the year that King Uzziah died, Isaiah saw a vision. The death of a certain person became an open door for God to show his servant what is about to take place. In our day and time, we have a Father in the Lord who has been a blessing not only to Asia but to the rest of the world. But last month, he left us to be with the Lord. I'm speaking of Pastor Yonggi Cho, the pastor of the world's largest church. I remember him once being in Indonesia. This was in Surabaya, where I was given the honor and the opportunity to share the platform with him. And as the keynote speaker, I heard him say this. The cloud that was over South Korea back in 1984, I see the cloud moving towards Indonesia. And that was, I believe, in 2006. That statement sort of stayed with me because it allowed me to see God's higher purposes, God's highest purposes for the nation of Indonesia and through the nation of Indonesia to the nations of the world. So as I waited before the Lord as to what he might want to say to Indonesia for such a time as this, he shared 4 very brief thoughts with me that I would like to lay before you. Jesus very eagerly wants to give birth to something powerful that will not just transform Indonesia, but transform the nations through Indonesia. And that something powerful is called the church in the marketplace. As we come into the early church in the book of Acts, that's what Jesus gave birth to, the church in the marketplace. That became a tool in the hand of Jesus, the Holy Spirit, that was so powerful that it transformed everything that it touched, transformed everything in its way, and eventually transformed the entire Roman Empire. And this statement comes from a church historian by the name of Rodney Stark, who makes this bold statement. The church in the marketplace brought about this massive transformation of the entire Roman Empire. The devil saw this, and therefore he needed to act quickly. So by the time we move from the early church to the European church, we see this idea from God breaking down, and from what we see as God's idea, it became a good idea, where the church began to posit itself, took a posture of the church versus the marketplace. The church was holy and the marketplace was unholy. Sunday was holy, the other 6 days are unholy. And Satan began to put a wedge between the church and the marketplace. And the moment that happened, the church stopped making ripples in the Roman Empire. No conversions, no transformation, no missions. This went on from 8300 to about 1950, before once again we see as the Spirit of God comes to America, where steps were being taken by the Spirit of God to reconcile both the church and the marketplace. This we can see happening in the evangelical church in the USA, and through men like Bill Hammond, who began to speak very early in the second half of the 20th century about what God intending to do in and through the church. And with that, we saw men like Demo Shakarian, who gave birth to the full gospel businessman that took the world by storm, and that was in 1952. And that happened immediately after the rebirth of Israel in 1948. So, in the last 70 years, the church in America, the evangelical church, have taken steps to bridge that gap, bridge that divide between the church and the marketplace through many other men. Since Bill Hammond, we have others like Lance Wallnau and Chuck Pierce and Peter Wagner, who are in their days and lifetime were championing this call. But now I believe that in the year 2021, as we are about to step into 2022, this whole thing is coming to Asia, from Israel to Europe to America, and now coming back to Asia. And I believe this is the last lap. And therefore, Jesus desperately wants to give birth or rebirth to the church in the marketplace. He wants to release the greatest force on earth that alone has the power to touch and transform everything it comes into contact with, transforming nations. And for that to happen, we need the church in the marketplace, the very tool that Jesus used to transform the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD. We need that in the 21st century AD. And I believe that God has chosen Indonesia to be Exhibit A, the ground in which He wants to sow the seed of the final reformation that will bring about transformation, Indonesia. And when I began to ask the Lord, why Indonesia? The strange answer that I got from the Lord was this: didn't I choose Indonesia to be the first nation in Asia to come into independence? Strange but true. Among the many nations in Asia, Indonesia was the first nation to step into its independence on August 17, 1945. Only after Indonesia had stepped into its independence did other nations such as India, Pakistan, Malaysia, Singapore began to come into their moment of independence. But Indonesia was the first, in that sense, the firstborn in Asia to come into independence. And I believe that what happened in the natural has supernatural ramifications. When Indonesia came into independence, August 17, 1945, no nation, near or far, no heads of state ever took time to congratulate President Sukarno, the founding president of Indonesia, Bapak Indonesia. Congratulations. They were afraid what the nations might think or say. President Sukarno had to wait 3 full years before he received his first public official congratulations. And surprisingly, it came from David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, after Israel became a state in 1948, 3 years after Indonesia. He called President Sukarno and conveyed his heartiest blessings on becoming the first president of Indonesia, the first nation in Asia to come into independence. I believe that stage has been set by God because God has higher purposes for the nation of Indonesia, things that our natural eyes will not allow us to see. Therefore, as we are taking time to understand, so what is God saying to Indonesia for such a time as this, I believe there are 2 things that I want to lay before you. 1, the urgent rebirth of the church in the marketplace as it was in the 1st century AD, so must it be in the 21st century AD. This will be the last move of God to give birth once again to the church in the marketplace, the greatest tool in the hand of God to bring about transformation of nations, the church in the marketplace, as we see that in the book of Acts. Not the church versus the marketplace, not the church and the marketplace, but the church in the marketplace. That's what we see Jesus gave birth in Acts chapter 2. Not inside the building, but in the agora, in the marketplace. But the reason why I believe that Jesus is doing this in Indonesia is because of a larger picture that is emerging before us. In our day and time, we see God doing some amazing things in the Middle East. Nations that were arch enemies with Israel for centuries have suddenly now turned 180 degrees and becoming friends with Israel. Nations such as Bahrain, nations such as the United Arab Emirates, nations such as Oman, Morocco, Sudan. These nations were for centuries arch enemies with Israel. But last year, we began to see a grand miracle, a glorious miracle take place right before our eyes as God began to turn these nations towards Israel. Thank God for what Donald Trump was able to do through the Abrahamic Accord. But behind Abrahamic Accord, behind Donald Trump was God at work, bringing about his purposes to pass. Just days before, Egypt Air began to officially fly now into Israel. Saudi Arabia has now given a green light to allow Israel to use its airspace. Something remarkable, something big is happening. So when I asked the Lord, so what's all this? And the Lord's answer was that he was opening Isaiah 19 highway, a grand highway that begins from the islands in the end of the earth. Isaiah 62, verse 11, a highway from the ends of the earth, the islands in the ends of the earth, and all the way to the Middle East, the Isaiah 19 highway that involves the Arab nations and Israel. Isaiah 19 verses 23, 24, and 25. So the big picture here that I see God doing in our day and time is to open up the highway in Isaiah 19, 23, 24, 25, involving Arab nations, Israel, Arab nations. And this is happening right before our eyes. And the ones who have been called to establish this highway, the economic highway, is Indonesia, called from the ends of the earth, the island from the end of the earth. You cited Isaiah 43 verses 18 and 19 as the core verse to share this moment, that God was calling Indonesia to look into the future as he's about to do something new, brand new, and that he's already begun that in the present, and that we are not called to dwell on the past. Using Isaiah 43 verses 18 and 19, if you just go one chapter before that, in Isaiah 42, we find Isaiah the prophet, before he says what he says in Isaiah 43 verses 18 and 19, he says something powerful to the islands at the end of the earth, the islands in the east. So here's my question, Indonesia. Was God, through Isaiah, speaking prophetically to Indonesia, the islands in the east? More than any other islands in the east, you are the largest pack of islands, what we call the archipelago or Nusantara in Bahasa, that occupies 3 time zones, and you are in the east and you are on islands. Could Isaiah the prophet have been speaking to you that through you and in you and by you, he intends to establish this economic highway into the Arab nations and Israel? Isaiah 19, 23, 24, and 25. For this highway to happen, this is an economic highway, and therefore Jesus needs the church in the marketplace to be activated again, to come alive again, and to become aggressive again. This is what I'm hearing from the Lord concerning Indonesia. And realizing that there is so much that God has invested into Indonesia, the time has come for Indonesia to rise to its God-given destiny and to allow Indonesia to be a blessing to the nations near and far. This is what I see happening starting the year 2022 and between 2029. The next 7 years are critically important for the church in Indonesia as you transform yourself once again to become the church in the marketplace, as it was in the book of Acts, to become a tool in the hand of Jesus, to become the most powerful force to transform not just the nation of Indonesia, but the nations in Asia and the nations in the Middle East. Thank you for allowing me to share this message. Tuhan memberkati.